All right. Any objections? Seeing none, bill is, what's our new word we're using? It's not, we introduced them on the floor, so we,
It's like approved for introduction.
yes.
We're not introducing them here. They're requested.
Oh, well, we're requesting the draft.
Okay.
Sponsored by the committee.
Yes.
Okay. I would like to request the draft of 25 RS 0377 regarding hemp in Kansas.
Okay. Any objections? Seeing none, it is approved.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Other bill introductions today? Seeing none, we do have a couple of members gone who had other responsibilities that they had to take care of, and so we let them do that. Okay, if everybody, hopefully they were about the computer. Representative Roser was bringing us sourdough bread today.
No, the sourdough starter's been fed.
Oh, it started. I don't know how it works.
Request to speak.
Go ahead,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative.
I have to
Rozier.
feed the sourdough starter. It's got to eat for like 48 hours before it goes. And then I got to do first step, and then I got to do stretch and folds for a day, and then I can bake it.
It's okay, so Tuesday we'll be
So
back.
Monday,
We won't be here Monday.
No,
Tuesday.
I know, that's fine. That's fine. No, I'm sorry. I don't know how it works, but we'll all learn something about agriculture and the way sourdough bread works.
Appreciate your persistence.
I know. This time of the day, I get a little hungry, so who's bringing the butter? So, anyway, or honey?
Gary White's bringing butter.
Okay, all right. He says he's not here? All right. So everybody knows how to get on the drive to see all this? It's not there?
Is it on the S drive? No, no. Oh, what's it on?
It's on the calendar.
Okay. All right. If seeing no other bill introductions, are we ready to go? And the presentation will also be up on the screen as well, so. Anyone online? Nobody's online, correct? Okay. Well, it is our pleasure. The last few years, we've been able to invite Dr. Alan Featherstone, who is the head of the Agriculture Economics Department at Kansas State University, to come and this is kind of a state of Kansas agriculture, if you will. He'll be making, I think, presentations in other places, and if you go to the Wichita State one here, he will talk about agriculture and that economy. We all know that last year was kind of a bit of a challenge. This next year may be a bit of a challenge even more, but I think this will give us a good idea. We will take questions at the end, and so, Dr. Featherstone, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to discuss the agricultural economy. I appreciate the opportunity to inform the committee with regards to where we are. What we're going to look at there we go.
I can do it.
Okay. If you want to move ahead. Whoop. Okay. What I'm going to talk about are about 4 or 5 things. I'll go over them pretty quickly. In the slide deck that I provided you, there's a lot of slides that I'm not going to talk about, such that if you want to look at different aspects in more in depth, certainly that information is there. But I'll spend some time and then be glad to entertain any questions on what I talk about, or even broader than the ag economy. I'm going to focus on the crop sector, in that is really where we're struggling. The livestock sector is really good. Right now, especially if you look at the cow-calf operations, the feeder sector is probably more tight, simply because high-priced cattle reduces the margins for those in the feeding industry. But the real struggle right now is on the crop side. And so I'll talk a little bit about where we've been declining and where we've been, focus a little bit with regards to net farm income, spent some aspects with regards to the financial stability. The financial stability of most farms in the state is still strong. Having some good years before you have a difficult situation makes the ability to move through that difficult situation a little bit easier. Then I'll spend some time looking at the revenue and cost drivers, kind of looking at 2 or 3 things that are really going to be important this next year. Spend some time looking at 24 and 25. Certainly 24 is done, but the accounts are still being tabulated from 24. And then we'll kind of finish up with land prices very quickly. Next slide. Okay. Essentially what I have here is just kind of a history of Kansas farm management income. We work with a set of roughly 1,500 farmers on a year-by-year basis to understand what they're doing from an income perspective, looking at different enterprises, just the overall situation. But the purple line here is looking at where we've been from a income perspective. You can see we moved from over 300,000 till the end of last year, which was right at 100,000. And then you can look at, we'll have some projections, but before, or looking at 2024, kind of back of the envelope connections, we're looking at a $40,000 net income. And so you can see that the net income is really dropped off for the farm economy. What I have in green is basically the USDA numbers, and one of the things you'll see is that in some respects, Kansas follows the United States as a whole. In some respects, this last downturn we entered into a little bit quicker simply because of the drought situation within Kansas that the overall economy did not experience as a whole. I think it's really important when you look at numbers, in terms of averages are certainly important, but the distribution is really key. And so what I've done here is look at the distribution of farms over the last 3 years. And you can see that the far right-hand side, in terms of 2021, was extremely positive in terms of most of the farms had incomes over 100,000. In terms of the biggest bin there was over 250,000, and I use these same cutoffs year after year after year. And if you would have told me that the biggest bin would have been farms making over $250,000, I wouldn't have believed you. In terms of, you can see essentially on the top side, you can see that the distribution has drastically fallen over the last 2 years. And so essentially those distributions have moved to the right. For those of you that like tables, essentially looking at that, in 2021, 1 out of 20 Kansas farms had negative net income. In terms of that, changed in 2023 to 1 out of 4. And so we went from 1 out of 20 to 1 out of 4 farms having net farm income. Again, not a good sign. If you look at where I expect we'll be in 2024, I think 2024 is going to be pretty close to 2023. And so, again, a substantial decrease with regards to net farm income. And then I have 50,000 there. The average family living for those that make 100% of their income off the farm is running about $80,000 on a family living perspective, and so I have a cutoff there of 50,000 just to look at that, and you can see that that number went from about 16% with negative, not earning it, the 50,000 to support their family living if that's their only source of income, to roughly about 50% of the farms. And so certainly it has been a declining picture. One of the things we haven't seen a lot so far, which is a positive, is looking at the debt situation. Debt situation, if you kind of look over since about 2019, essentially over the last 4 or 5 years, that debt picture's bounced up and down a little bit per farm, but essentially it's remained at about $750,000 per farm. And so one of the good signs so far is we haven't seen a big need to go out and borrow and denigrate the financial situation with borrowing. Certainly part of that was just the high incomes. In the previous years, farmers were able to increase their liquidity and essentially keep from going into a debt situation. To give you a little bit of an indication of where the debt changed, and essentially we're looking at about a $50,000 increase in debt from the end of 2022 to the end of 2023. Most of that is on the current side. Essentially 40,000 or 41,000 was on the current liabilities. Essentially 1,000 on the intermediate side, and then roughly about 9,000 or 10,000 on the long-term side. And so, again, this is just indicating that liquidity is getting tight on these operations. And so, in order for them to plant their crops and go from year to year, there's much more current borrowing than there had been previously. This is another way to picture this, and it's a little longer time frame to look at the liquidity picture. What this is current assets minus current liabilities divided by the asset level. And you can end up seeing that we were up there about 13–14%, and that is deteriorated to about 11%. And so we did have a rapid decrease in the liquidity picture. We'll probably see a further erosion in 2024 when those numbers are out, and looking into 2025, unless we see a big change in the output prices for the main commodities, corn, wheat, sorghum, and soybean, we'll likely see a further deterioration of the liquidity picture in 2025. In terms of repayment capacity, what this number is basically, do I have the ability to repay my principal and interest with earnings on the farm? One of the things you'll see here, and why I show that, is the blue line is basically 100%, where essentially you have enough cash income on the farm to pay off your principal and interest. One of the things you'll see is that's pretty rare in agriculture, in terms of essentially you see a lot of lines below there, and so anytime you get above that blue line, it's been a really, really good year in the sector. One of the things you see is that went from a couple of years ago in 2021, where essentially they had $2 to pay every dollar of principal and interest, to about, now they have about 60 cents to pay every dollar of principal and interest. Again, it's not uncommon, but again, obviously it just indicates some of the stress within there. You can see that there were many years all the way from the 1980s all the way to about 2005 where it was pretty common that we were under that line. And so farmers can manage that situation, but it's not a great situation to have to manage in terms of they're good at dealing with the sector, they're very resilient, but again, it just does indicate stress with regards to the sector. The key thing, and really when you talk to farmers from a federal policy perspective, the number one thing they want is crop insurance. In terms of if federal farm policy does a lot of things, don't touch the crop insurance. And this is kind of a classic example. If you look at the last 2 years in Kansas, and I have the state numbers, and then I have kind of 6 districts across the state to just show the differential impact. But if you look on a state level basis, in 22 and 23, essentially the average farmer received $180,000 in crop insurance. And so, again, we suffered through 2 severe droughts in 21 or 22 and 23. And for many farmers, the crop insurance that they received ended up being pretty important. You can see that it's much different if you go in the northeast part of the sector, essentially virtually no crop insurance proceeds. And how I have this defined is the proceeds you receive minus the premium paid. And if you look at the northeast, they did not suffer the characteristics of the drought. And so the fact that those are close to zero is a good thing. In terms of, I like to use the crop insurance example, such as I did not use my life insurance last year. I view that as a good thing. In terms of, I don't know if my wife did or not, but certainly I viewed that as a good thing. And so the fact that farmers are not paying or receiving proceeds is a good thing. Simply it means you had a good crop, you had good income, and so everybody would rather be in that situation. the last 2 years were very difficult. If you look at western Kansas, in terms of in the Northwest, essentially the average farm received more than $260,000 and $130,000. And so, again, it just shows the drastic effects negatively of the drought. And certainly it shows that the crop insurance program does kind of work in terms of those that have the biggest losses get the biggest payments, and those that have small losses essentially get no payments or very small payments. But I think it's really important to realize that we would be in a much different if the average farm did not receive $180,000 in payments over the last 2 years. Again, if you kind of think of that and just split it in half, the net farm income for 23 was about $90,000, and then if you add the crop insurance net proceeds, that's about $90,000. And so essentially, the average would have been very close to zero if you relied on market income as it is. One of the big things affecting the situation is inflation and the big run-up in prices. One of the things that you indicate here is really so far, other than sorghum, we haven't seen any drawback in prices. As we go into 25 and when we see the number in 24, there's actually a couple bright spots there in that the cost of producing the crop, the fertilizer cost has dropped a little bit, and we'll show that a little coming up. Interest costs have not dropped in terms of they haven't risen. They've been stable for about the last 18 months. But essentially, the two big drivers to really look at are whether or not fertilizer costs will go down, and we'll show some information that that's likely to occur. And then interest costs are pretty steady. The other thing, and while we talked about crop insurance, it's important to realize that the way that program works, the safety net is being lowered. And so as prices are lowered, essentially that safety net is lowered. To give an indication, the month of February, we will determine what the reference price is going to be for corn, sorghum, and soybeans. And based on where we are now, from a corn perspective, essentially we might be looking at about a $4.50 guarantee. 2 years ago, that was $5.91. And so essentially what that means is farmers are going to bear more of the risk on their farm simply because that insurance premium essentially is not going to have as much coverage. To give a little bit of an indication in terms of on the corn market, we're expecting about a 2.1% decrease in that safety net. If you look at that from a soybean perspective, we're looking at about a 10% decrease in the safety net. And probably the biggest concern is wheat, where essentially we're looking at a 20% decrease in the safety net. And so basically, those percentages, you can kind of interpret those as this is how much more risk the farmers are going to bear on their operation. But the key thing is that safety net is actually falling as it is. The good thing is we've gotten a lot of moisture. We see a lot of snow on the ground. That's kind of a good thing. And so the likelihood of a drought is probably less than it had been a couple of years previously. And so moisture is one of the things that is extremely important. But it is important that if we would end up with a drought this year, essentially the indemnities that would be paid to the producers would be lower than it was the last 2 years, simply because of that decrease in reference price and the guarantee. The other thing I think that is concerning is the price situation in terms of essentially this graph here kind of looks at the 4 major commodities produced in Kansas. And essentially the first column of numbers, the 480, basically says that if I contracted my wheat today for sale at Salina, essentially I could get $4.80 a bushel. In terms of or that's a cash bid. And so if I would sell my wheat today, it would be $4.80. The next column says that if I contract my 2025 crop, I could get $5.13 per bushel. And to give you an indication, just 2 years ago, it was $8.86. And so essentially, you're looking at a cash price about $4 less per bushel of wheat. And so again, when you see the cost going up and the price going down, it makes it a difficult situation. And then you have the numbers for corn, sorghum, and soybeans here. The key thing is the prices have fallen drastically in the last 2 years. And so they are facing a difficult commodity aspect unless we see the world prices increase. And essentially, if I would have presented this 2 weeks ago, the prices would have been lower. In terms of the last USDA report came out, bumped soybeans up about 30 cents, corn up about a dime. And so in some respects, the picture is brighter than it was 2 weeks ago, but still it is relatively low with regards to the output prices. Acquisition of funds, the key thing here is that essentially you have what Farm Credit acquires their money for off of Wall Street. And so essentially for 1-year money, you're looking at 4.2%. For 30-year money, 5.6%. Really the key thing here is, yes, these are higher. They haven't been increasing over the last 18 months to 24. They've been fairly flat in terms of essentially the best way to think about farm interest rates is they follow U.S. Treasury rates extremely closely. And so essentially farms basically pay from about 0.1% to about 1% more than what you can borrow from the Treasury. And so the rates are tied. And so if you want to kind of anticipate what's happening with regards to farm acquisition or farm borrowing rates, they are going to follow this. Again, this is a cost that Farm Credit gets their money at, so there's certainly a premium in that banks need to charge in order to cover their operating expense. But I think this is a pretty good measure of just what the costs of funds are, at least for the Farm Credit system. This is one of the bright spots in terms of this is the nitrogen, and these were as of last Thursday. Essentially, the big picture here is they have decreased, and so roughly over the last, I would say 12 months, 14 months, we've seen a drastic decrease off of nitrogen and other fertilizer products. The best way to think about, for those of you that don't follow the farm economy, think about gas price. In terms of fertilizer, are very much petroleum based, and so as the petroleum price falls, essentially that means that the fertilizer price is falling. And so it's, again, there's a pretty good correlation between that. But the big thing here is there is a good situation going forward with regards to the cost of nitrogen. We do some projections with regards to net farm income, and again, these were made in August. The situation hasn't changed drastically from August. The key thing to look at that is 2024, in terms of our estimates in August in the department, were roughly about 45,000. And so, again, that's pretty low. They are expected to bounce a little bit up in 2025, but that's going back to more normal yields is kind of what is expected to bounce those incomes up. And these numbers are a little bit small, but essentially the American Relief Act of 2025 that was just passed kind of with the budget reconciliation at the federal level is going to have big impacts within the state of Kansas. Our estimate is that the average Kansas farm is going to receive about $46,000 in income. The way that this is done is based off these prices per acre for the different commodities. What we ended up using is we went back and looked at each of the farms, looked at their crops, and then allocated it based on their 23 crops. We don't know what the 24 crops are. Our heroic assumption there, which isn't so heroic, is that crop portfolio in 24 is going to be similar to 2023. If that's the case, the average farmer is going to get $45,000, and so if you add the $45,000 onto the $44,000 of net farm income for 2024, even though the money is received in 2025, it's going to be fairly substantial in terms of helping farm families with regards to it. But again, that is pretty important The last thing I want to talk about, land values. This is the bright spot in Kansas. Land values have continued to go up, and so certainly that helps the lending community. But in terms of looking at that, essentially over the last 3 years, we've had a 23, 14, and an 8% increase in land values. Essentially, over that 3-year period, we've had more than a 50% increase in the value of farmland, which ends up being about 80% of the assets on the balance sheet. And so, again, if our retirement portfolio over the last 3 years would have went up 50%, would all be happy. And so this is a bright spot for the farmers. The big thing is that's the wealth aspect and not an income aspect. And so essentially you make your payments out of income, but it is always nice to have your wealth go up, even though you don't have the cash at the point. And then some people like to compare that with inflation adjusted. And essentially, over this time, we've beat inflation by 35%. And so certainly, the land values are a bright spot. Probably in 2025, we're going to see more of a softening, whether or not that is level or slightly positive or maybe slightly negative, that's there. But again, it's been a good picture. And so again, from 2021, we're about 70% decrease in income. And essentially, crop insurance was really key. We would be in a lot worse situation without crop insurance. Working capital is deteriorating, and so that will be more short-term borrowing within the sector. 24 is going to be a tough year. 25 probably will be a little bit better, but really the American Relief Act is pretty important with regards to that. So with that, we'll just take questions.
Okay, Dr. Featherstone, thank you so much. Lots of numbers, lots to digest, and I'm sure those that aren't on the farm got it all figured out, right? No, I know. I was seeing some wow, okay, trying to piece all this together. So, anybody have any questions? If not, I'll start, and then we'll go from there. Representative Mosley.
First, thank you for that presentation. So just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, when you talked about the debt and farmers, that is including the subsidies that they get from the federal government or excluding the subsidies that they get from the federal government?
Yeah, when I talk about the debt, that would be excluding the subsidies. And so essentially what that is that's what they owed the banker as of January 1, 2024. Essentially the $750,000. Again, if you look at it on a debt to asset ratio, it's not bad in terms of essentially we're down between 21, 22%. To give a picture, and I do have a slide kind of at the end, and I'm not going to pull it up, but essentially there's a long-term debt to asset ratio. And in the farm crisis from essentially 1985 to about 2005, essentially that debt to asset ratio was about 35%. And so now it's about 22%. And so in some respects, on a percentage basis, we're much better off than we were kind of from 1985 to 2005. Those were okay years for farmers. Difficult years, they had to manage their operation well, and so there is opportunity for that debt to increase. Or the other way would be for asset values to go down, specifically land, if that dropped, and that's what happened in the 1980s. But essentially, the $750,000 is a relatively safe position. The thing is that is something to watch, kind of going into 25, 26.
I have one more question. And for those who are taking on debt, how many of those farmers are contracted with like big ag and they have to like buy things to be within regulations within big ag?
Most of the debt would be on land and machinery. And essentially, if you look at most Kansas producers, most of them just sell into the market. And so, again, world politics, world supply and demand conditions probably affect the Kansas farmer more than the agribusiness sector.
Other questions? Representative Gardner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you gave your presentation, you indicated that things like crop insurance and government payments are a big factor in farm income. Those are federal programs. What state policy has the most impact on the survivability of our ag producers? And moving forward, what state policies do you think would have the most impact at helping stabilize the farms as we're moving into a time when profitability doesn't appear to be as good, hasn't been for 2 years, and may not recover very soon?
Certainly, the use value tax appraisal is certainly important in terms of if you would compare our property taxes compared to what Nebraska, for example, is paying. Ours are quite a bit lower. Again, that's a policy decision that you have to determine as a legislature in terms of what's the right number on that. And so certainly taxation policy within that, but probably use value appraisal is probably more important from a farm perspective than the income tax situation. In terms of other things from a state policy perspective, is water is pretty important, especially for the irrigated sector. And so that's more of a longer term situation than a short term, but certainly water policy, I think, is something that, again, the Ag and Natural Resource Committees will look at. But you are correct. Most of the time, it's federal farm policy that is key, and then in some respects, world geopolitical aspects in terms of, for example, when the war broke out between Russia and Ukraine, that had huge benefits for the Kansas farmer simply because that popped prices up. Again, it's difficult sometimes to benefit when others are in harm and in suffering, but certainly the world situation is extremely important. Right now, people are trying to figure out in Brazil if they're in a drought situation or not. That has important ramifications. And so in some respects, international and national are probably more important, other than when you get to tax policy, water policy, things that traditionally the state of Kansas has invested in. And so hopefully that helps.
Thank you very much.
Representative Page?
You mentioned water briefly, and I appreciate everything because I'm not a farmer. I'm just trying to understand. But in terms of technology, how do we help our farmers? Some things we're dealing with nature. I get that. But are there some other things we can do that can help? And then you get into the controversy with the windmills and all that. I don't know. I'm just trying to figure it out.
I think certainly having a stable water policy such that farmers can make investments long term. Again, a water investment, if you put in equipment to be more efficient in water use, again, that's not a 1-year payoff. It might be a 20-year payoff. And so it's, I think, very important as you think of water that it's a long-term type aspect, and just realizing that farmers cannot get the benefit out of 2 or 3. And so drastically switching policies in water, I think, are something to think about. But again, if there is a stable understanding, there may be cost share type things that could be there to be more efficient in water use. Certainly those are things that perhaps the state might want to consider. But I think stability in something like water policy, and even stability in tax policy, I think, are important, such that producers can react to what the rules of the game are.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
Representative Minix?
Thank you, Dr. Featherston. I represent a rural district out west. We've got 4.5 million acres scattered over 9 counties. If I use a conservative figure on your dollars per acre of about 2,000. And that would include irrigated ground, grassland, and dryland crop ground. That's over $9 billion. That same value just a few years ago was about $7 billion. We've seen so much growth or inflation in the cost of that land. It's extremely difficult for someone that isn't very heavily capital wealthy to get into the industry. But you did a great job on crop production. If I ask you to do the same thing on livestock production, those numbers would look so much different. And many of the producers out in my area try to integrate a little bit and diversify. So they're cropland and they're also livestock producers. And that's how we're in a cycle right now where the cropland looks to be in a position that it's not very much payback. Especially if you figure your $50,000 per family that you need to survive, besides the farming operation, many of them have a cattle operation, which right now is a phenomenal return if you're in a cow-calf industry. So those things kind of even out, and that's how agriculture's operated for the last 250 years in this country, it seems like. We have to diversify a little bit to survive and move forward. Am I close, Dr. Featherston?
Yeah, in terms of the cow-calf operation is extremely profitable right now. The big thing is more of that's going to be in the east with the Flint Hills in terms of than the west in terms of it's hard to raise grass with limited water out west. And so we've also seen a little bit in terms of less diversification across farms. And to me, you are exactly correct. Having that diversification, especially in this case, I think a lot of individuals wish they wouldn't have sold off their cattle operations a few years ago. But it is kind of cyclical. The big thing, if you get out west, that's where a lot of the feedlots are, and in some respects, they're beginning to struggle simply because they're paying for high-priced calves to put in their lots, and so the break-evens are a little bit tighter. And so certainly, I think what you point out very astutely is just the differential aspect, even on the livestock side across the state of Kansas, in terms of where the money right now is in the cattle sector is mostly in the cow-calf type enterprises, simply because there's not a lot of calves relatively to the long-term cycle out there. And so essentially, those are going to be bid up by the feedlots as they need to get close to capacity to increase their efficiency.
I guess I'd also point out that the proximity of that livestock to our crop production increases, and I'll let you explain basis to everybody here. Things are mainly based off of a commodity market out of Chicago, but in your specific location, it has a basis, which is the difference between what your local market is and there. If you have something close to you as a final market for that grain product that we produce, if it's cattle or a soybean crush or something like that, it makes a huge difference on the prices out there. So with a combination of livestock and crop production, it helps raise the tide and float all boats a little bit more economically.
Yes, it certainly does. One of the cautions in terms of Western Kansas feedlot, in short crops, that basis actually goes positive, and so they're paying more than Chicago would be for the grain. And so in some respects, there have been situations on producers I know that are producing feed for livestock that are really concerned in terms of whether or not there's enough grain out there in order to process into the feed for the cattle. That will occur, but essentially they're going to pay more for that grain than they typically would. They'll pass that on to the livestock feeders, and so they may not see as much of a decrease in price in western Kansas that you've seen in eastern Kansas. And so the whole aspect of supply and demand, which creates that basis level, again, is not favorable to western Kansas since they've suffered a couple significant droughts.
Other questions? All right. Your last thing you said on your summary, 2025 will be a difficult income year for crop farms unless commodity prices increase. And I read that back to see, come Monday, we have a new administration. The incoming administration wants to bring back higher tariffs. Have you done analysis on what those higher tariffs will mean to our prices, to the bottom line, to how many acres might be planted, working with other folks within your department, of what that means and at what level could it really put a pinch?
Certainly, that's an important issue. I think it's important also to recognize is the last time we went to higher tariffs, there was a program to essentially make up that difference to farmers, to essentially make them whole. And so in some respects, it's kind of a two-headed question. In tariffs alone, in terms of if that decreases prices, that would be bad. The issue is whether or not the administration would try to do something like they did when they were previously in terms of essentially providing cash to make that whole. And so that one's just an open issue. Generally, tariffs, if there's not anything offsetting, are going to lower prices. But if they do come back with a cash payment, it may not have as much effect as it is. And so I'm not good at forecasting policy and that, but to me, I think from the previous time the Trump administration was in power, they did go back and essentially create a program to try to make the farmers whole for their tariff policy. And whether or not that will occur in the future, I'll let you guys, you're politicians, you can prognosticate policy probably better than I can.
Well, just kind of curious of what that might mean if you've done some analysis. I know your colleagues over at the Farm Doc, in Illinois have done, they do a lot of that, and maybe sometimes they spend more than what maybe, but I don't, but you kind of have to know so you're not surprised.
Right, and again, we do have individuals in the department. I'm not sure what numbers they have at this point, but I can get those if anybody wants them.
The American Relief Act that got passed right here at the end of the year is going to bring some relief. Looks like sometime next month, early March, maybe by the time the Farm Service Agency gets it and gets this support out to farmers. That could be a little inflationary, right, to what our numbers would show for net farm income?
Yeah, certainly it would be in terms of essentially whether or not you would add that to 2024, which are the numbers that we'll use to calculate that, or whether or not you add it to 2025, but certainly adding $45,000 per farm is going to be a good thing for helping them through this situation that we're in.
Other questions? Representative Fairchild?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You might not know the answer to this either, but, this is just more of a response to the question that was asked, but, maybe the tariffs are already factored into the prices because, we already have an idea that Trump will probably raise tariffs. Maybe if he doesn't raise tariffs by as much as people think, maybe that'll actually cause prices to go up.
Certainly there is the possibility that some of those tariffs are in, and just what the probability that those tariffs would hit agricultural commodities. And so your scenario makes a lot of sense, that if they're not as big as the market has anticipated, you could see some more increase in price.
They bake a bunch of cakes or sourdough breads or whatever, as the policy is. So, any other questions? I don't want to take too many, Representative Minix, or I don't want to give too many, so Representative Minix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll steal one of your questions. The chicken flu stuff that's going around, has decreased the poultry population, and now the current price of eggs has risen. Am I close on my analogy there?
Yes, absolutely, in terms of there are less poultry in the country, especially layers, and that has increased the price of eggs quite drastically, at least in the Midwest. I think you're seeing $5.50 to $6 a dozen for eggs, and typically those were $2.50, $3, even before that, down the $1.50 range. And so you've seen a big effect from the avian influenza affect the price of eggs within the state of Kansas.
To me, that's a real simple way of viewing economics in the agricultural sector. When we're short on supply, the prices are much higher, and the inverse is the same also, but that just kind of illustrates where farmers are right now.
No, I would agree. I think the other thing long-term, in terms of I'm very bullish long-term agriculture, in terms of essentially we have a growing world population. And if you look at supply and demand for food products, in terms of perhaps in 2 or 3 years, we could be talking about a shortage. And so while my comments in some respects are probably more pessimistic at this point, I'm still very bullish on agriculture in the long term. Again, you're looking at, as people's income rise globally, you're going to end up seeing more consumption of protein. And there are estimates that that could double by 2050. And so, again, if that would double, that would increase demand. And so while we're in a tough spot right now due to the drought and just due to good production globally, the picture could change very, very quickly. And so long term, I'm extremely bullish on agriculture.
Representative Mosier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You have a slide that talks about the variable costs of production per acre. Could you just share with the group what goes into, what does it cost to put in an acre of corn? Because it's a lot more than just buying the seed.
Yes, essentially it would be the seed, obviously, in terms of fertilizer. In terms of fertilizer is probably the biggest cost that producers would end up paying on an acre basis. Then you have crop protection, essentially bugs, weeds are things that are farmers' nemesis, and so you do need those crop protection processes. Simply, as you plant a crop, you want to keep it healthy, and so those are expenses. And then you have operation in terms of fuel, some limited machinery repair, those type of things that are important. You also have the labor in there. You do have interest expense, and so you are very much correct. And I think in there is a slide kind of comparing 2023 enterprise costs on a variable cost basis with the 5-year average. And so that's kind of beyond the last slide that I showed, but if you want to take a look at what those costs are relative and how they've changed over time, those are in the slides.
One more. Thank you. And also you have your land. You're either making a land payment or you're paying cash rent. So
and
is that,
typically that's going to be more of a fixed cost as opposed to the variable cost. But yes.
But it's there.
It's there, and it's increased over time. And so the land cost is fairly substantial. And again, there's also a slide in there that kind of looks at the variable costs compared to the total costs on an enterprise basis for 2023. And so you can get an indication of what that fixed land cost and fixed machinery cost are. We tend as economists to look at the variable costs simply because economics says that's where the shutdown point is. When you can't cover your variable costs anymore, you don't want to plant a crop. We're still covering our variable costs, so that's pretty important. But we're in a situation where 2023 and probably 2024 did not cover total costs.
Thank you for that, Dr.
Representative
Featherstone.
Mosley?
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. All right, I have one last question. I'm trying to word this in a way that's not political, but how many, a lot of these farmers are kind of running on razor thin margins, it looks like. How many farmers will be impacted if they lost the ability to hire low-wage workers that will take a sub-minimum wage, and how would that impact their ability to make a profit?
Certainly, labor is a big issue within the state of Kansas. And in terms of the price of labor is important. Immigration policy is pretty important from a farm perspective. Again, it's not usually solved by a state aspect. It's going to be more of a federal type aspect. But one of the things that we're getting more and more requests for is figuring out how to deal with the visa issue, and can we use those policies to bring labor in. Probably a little bit more on the livestock side than the crop side, but it's certainly important for Kansas agriculture as a whole.
All right, any other questions? I have one more. If not, this presentation, thank you, is a lot about basically the major crops in Kansas. We have a lot of new members from the other side of the state that some of us live on the east. More specialty crops continue to grow. More almost urban farmers, if you will, or have an acre or two, and they're helping to feed their neighbors and so on. Could you talk just a little bit about that and the impact that has on? I mean, I know we're talking about economics today, but there's a portion there, especially many that really kind of grew out of COVID, but there's still several successful farmers in the east that are getting a good return on a smaller acreage.
Yeah, and certainly the key there is finding a market and finding a stable market. In terms of if you have that market, it can be very profitable. The issue is how much premium is the consumer willing to pay to get something locally produced or organic compared to other crops that are shipped across the world or across the United States. And so I think as long as there's markets and things that policy that can be made to help farmers markets and other buy local type things would certainly be helpful for those. And that is something that probably could be enacted on a statewide basis or even a regional basis. But again, the key to making fruits and vegetables work is being able to make sure you have a market that you can place those into grocery stores, farmers markets, specialty supermarkets is really, really important.
Okay. Seeing no other questions, Dr. Featherstone, thank you so much for being. Did we get you out of class today, or?
Class starts on Tuesday.
Oh, that's
so.
right. We still had another
Yeah.
a few days. So good. Well, I'm glad it all worked out. So thank you very much for being here. All right. Our next meeting will be Tuesday. What are we doing? We will have an update on HPAI with the state veterinarian, Dr. Justin Smith. So I think hopefully that will be interesting, because I think it was brought up, it's affecting more than say chickens, some backyard flocks, but also the impact on others. And I'm glad we have two veterinarians here that could be a very interesting discussion. So anything else for the good of the cause or committee? If not, I'm sorry? Coach, that's right. Sunday sometime, I don't know when, but again, no meeting tomorrow, and we will see you on Tuesday at 3:30, or give or take. We are dismissed.